Welcome to today's Conversation podcast. Today I'm privileged to host a distinguished economist, a distinguished academic. He was an associate professor of political economy at the Africa Institute. He's also been a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town's Graduate School of Business, where he also directed an MBA. Today he's based in the United Arab Emirates. His name is Associate Professor Grieve Chelwa. Grieve Chelwa, I'm privileged to host you today, and I'm privileged that today you are breaking the ground for my first remote podcast.
Honor to be talking with you. I am a big fan of your Conversation podcast, and I'm happy that you the first guest to be doing it. It's incredible honor. So thank you for having me.
No, thank you very much. We know you are trained even from Harvard University, and you've taught at Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. You make public commentaries regularly on economic issues in Zambia. But people may not know who Grieve Chelwa is. Let's start there. Tell us about yourself.
Thanks a lot. And I hope you're able to hear me loud and clear, and there's no
You're very
delay on
clear.
the video on your side. Okay, thanks a lot. So who is Grieve Chelwa? I mean, first and foremost, I'm a Zambian, which is the most identity that I hold. I'm a Zambian, born in Zambia. I was born in 1993 at the University Teaching Hospital, Lusaka, Zambia, on 19th March. And then I did all my schooling in Zambia from first grade all the way up to 12th grade. I don't know, Ambassador, how detailed you want me to go into. Should I talk about all the schools that I went into from first grade to 12th grade?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I started
because when Zambians see you this distinguished, it was ordinary for you at these prestigious universities in the world, they might not relate that you just grew up here and the opportunities you've had can make any Zambian excel.
That's true. And I think part of my story is related to the conversation that we'll have later about the importance of policy that is advantageous to all Zambians, because I think in many ways I am a testament to that story because of the time that I was born and the kind of schools that I went to and that kind of thing. So yes, I was born at UTH on 19th March 1983. UTH was a public hospital which obviously our forefathers and mothers brought into existence. I don't know where I would have been born if that hospital had never been built up. Again, a note to the importance of infrastructure. I started my first grade at Gala Basic School in a primary school in Chipata, Eastern Province. And I think that was 1989 or 1990, I can't remember. I think 1990 it was. So I spent a couple of years at Kanjala in Eastern Province. And then I did a year in third grade at a school called Chongololo in Chipata. I used to work for the agricultural bank, which we dated in the 90s. But my dad used to work for Lima, which was in the east there. And then from Chongololo, I came to Rhodes Park in Lusaka. I came to Rhodes School that now belongs to Mr. Chisha Folotia, I think. I spent a year at Rhodes Park. From there, I went off to finish my primary school at Chadley House School. So, and one part of the explanation of why my father began to favor private schools at that point in our history was a very difficult time.
There was a decline in services for public health, public education. I think we're falling.
And this is not unrelated to what the IMF and World Bank were asking us to do at that time. So these things are a great deal, because the reason why there was that decline is because we are undergoing structural adjustment programs. And part of what they were asking was to cut back investments in people, right? Cut back on health, education, and so on and so forth, agriculture, and so on and so forth. So the quality began in our public schooling system. And my father gambled. He said, look, I need to give my son a chance. So I'll try to gather all the ways I can and put in him so that he can go to a private school. So I wrote my grade 7 at Chadley House School in 1996. From there, I went to Munali Secondary School, where I grade 8 and 9. That was 1997 and 1998. I did grade 8 and 9. And then in 1999, I went to David County. So after writing grade 9 and passing grade 9, I was selected to David County. And you know, Ambassador Mwamba, selection to David and Hillcrest, at least at that time, up until that time, I don't know what it's like now, but it was highly, highly competitive.
Yeah, correct.
Luckily, I was fortunate. I got into Rwanda in grade 10, starting 1999. Completed my secondary school in 2001 at DK, and thereafter, University of Zambia, 2003, where I studied for a degree in economics. So I did a major in economics and a minor in statistics. And I was taught by some of Zambia's most incredible teachers, and then I finished in 2007. I graduated, with a degree in economics, major, minor statistics. And then I went into industry. I was fortunate enough to, again, the economic policy. I was fortunate to graduate at a time when the economy was doing very well. So I'm graduating in 2007. This is now the high point of the Mwanawasa and
administration.
Economic
the data has been written off. We seem to have free resources, and the economy is growing.
It's growing. The copper prices have recovered after this long decline, which dominated much of the Kaunda regime. After this long, almost 3-decade decline in copper prices, in about 2002, they begin to recover. So I entered the job market in 2007 during this period of expansion and optimism. My own sort of analysis, this we were growing about 10% per annum average in this period. So this is the job market that I enter, right? So it was not very difficult to get a job. I remember maybe 3 or 4 interviews lined up with banks. I think I had an interview like Finance Bank, I had an interview lined up with Standard Chartered Bank. I had an opportunity at the Bank of Zambia because I had gotten a Bank of Zambia scholarship as a student. They had funded part of my studies because I'd gotten, because of, academic performance, I got a Bank of Zambia scholarship. So there was also a potential internship in the central bank. And I think even an opportunity at professional insurance. But after consulting, which is what you do when you're young, you need to consult. You need to consult all the time, but especially at that period when you're young. I mean, I think I'm 23 or 24. I can't remember the age that I'm in the job market. So I spoke to a lot of people, and everybody told me Standard Chartered Bank is a great bank. Take the Standard Chartered opportunity.
Well, it's been in the country for over 110 years.
Exactly. And so I know you yourself have been a banker at one point in last year's career. So I then joined Standard and operations clerk, working in the office at Standard Chartered Kablonga branch. More there, and I doubt if it's there anymore. I was a clerk there at Standard Chartered Kablonga Bank for little less than 2 or 3 months. I can't remember. Again, expansion. I got a call from Citibank. So I got a call from Citibank saying, "Hey, young man, we're looking for some people for a new program across Africa. A management training program that's going to take people from different parts of the continent, place them in Johannesburg as an experiment to train a new crop of leaders in the bank. So your name popped up somehow. Would like to meet you for interviews." So I went to Citibank's. They used to be in Chachacha, on Chachacha Road there, if you remember. They've now moved to Alunda Park. They used to be on Chachacha Road. I went there, a series of very good interviews, capped off with an interview with Mr. Xavier Chivia, who was then the managing director. As you know, I think Xavier Chivia is now working at the group level. I think based in Johannesburg.
With ABSA.
With ABSA now, yes, he's ABSA, yeah, correct. So Xavier gave me one of the most interviews of my life, and then I succeeded. So I was then recommended to join Citibank Johannesburg, and this is now July of 2007. I think that's...
Oh, okay.
So after 3 months of working with Stanchart, I leave to go to Johannesburg. First time I'm getting on a plane. First time I've left the country before. This was briefly when we used to live in Chipata, go next door
to Malawi.
What some people
by road.
By road. Changing border there. But this was the first real time that I was, going to the
jumping on a plane.
Airport, jumping on a plane, and arrived in Johannesburg in July of 2007 for a 2-year career with Citibank. For 2 years, 2007 and 2008. But a combination of factors. I always wanted to be an academic, Ambassador Mwamba. So even when I was doing banking, I love this life of a life of knowledge, a life of teaching, of research. So I always knew that this was just temporal. I'm doing this to go back, to do some saving, but the ultimate plan was to go to university. So in 2009, I arrived in Cape Town. I left Johannesburg to Cape Town.
When your contract ran with the bank?
It didn't even finish. In fact, I just wrote an email to them. And, I would like to resign, and I would like to go pursue a master's degree. So a couple of people tried to talk me to figure out what was going on, but I think they could see that this man is not made out for life in the bank. And to be honest, I was a misfit in the banking world. I only had one pair of one suit, So, clearly I was a misfit for banking. And to be honest, I wouldn't have made a very great banker. A lot of respect, but I got cut out for banking, So this is when I left, Ambassador Mwamba. I left Citibank in December of 2000. And then sometime in January 2009, I reported at the University of Cape Town, where I continued my studies beyond degree, which I earned. And then I built on to get a master's degree. So 2009 and 2010, I studied for my master's, which I completed at the end of 2010 in economics. And immediately I got offered a job with a Cape Town consulting company, development consulting company called the Center for Financial Regulation and Inclusion. So I started there as a researcher. The position was research analyst, I think, 2011. So 2011 full-time as a researcher. But again, this hunger I have for an academic career kept falling, So eventually realized, okay, I think I belong in the university. I'm a lifelong student, a career student. I've got to go back. So at the end of then I resigned that position, and then I went for a PhD at the University of Cape Town. Again, so for an additional advanced. So I PhD 2012, 2013, 2014, and then 2015 I finished my PhD. PhD takes roughly
3 to 4 years.
3 to 4 years, 5 years sometimes. So I completed that. I handed my thesis. I have to make an argument, a new argument. I handed in my thesis in 2015. It was...
What was your thesis based on?
My thesis was a health economics topic. So really... advancing arguments about how do you use fiscal policy, how do you use fiscal tools like taxes to encourage healthy behavior. For example, one may think of king, one may think about alcohol consumption, one may think about salt consumption, this non-communicable diseases and related to smoking, the abject effects of alcoholism.
You are the people that make taxes on alcohol, sugar, cigarettes high.
Exactly, for good reason.
Correct.
Because sometimes citizens need to behave healthily. It's kind of like a seatbelt. There was a time, Ambassador Mwamba, I was born in an era where seatbelts were not compulsory. I remember driving a car without having seatbelts, and then at some point seatbelts arrived. So it's kind of related to that. Sometimes citizens need to be reminded, and you could remind by putting up a police roadblock, or you can impose a tax. The effect can be similar. So I finished my PhD in 2015. When I finished my PhD, I got an offer from Harvard University to become.
That was a rare opportunity.
Yeah, surprisingly.
What do you attribute that to?
So at the time, in 2014, I began to blog. I began to share my ideas with the world, just as a way of taking a break from writing the thesis, because the thesis can be a very intense, sometimes a very involving type of exercise. So in my spare time, I would write blogs, I'd write blogs, communicate with the wider world what I'm learning as an economics student. And I would also opine on Zambian issues here and there sometimes. So I suspect this in some circles. So a professor of economics there at Harvard University, going on to be a friend of mine, his name is Nathan Nunn, brought me an email and he just said, Grieve, we are setting up a new postdoctoral research fellowship, and I put your name forward for consideration. And I hope you're okay with that. And if you're okay with that, may you send me your CV, something to that effect.
Wow.
I never thought much of it. I said, what are the chances? I mean, the chances are slim. I consulted my wife at the time was my fiance and subsequently became my wife. Her name is Mwansa. I consulted Mwansa. I said, this thing has come. I don't know if it is a joke or not. What should I do?
Did you meet Madam Mwansa in Zambia or in Cape Town or in Johannesburg?
Oh, that's another story. We met at DK. Remember, I was at DK.
The days of DK. Okay.
Yeah, so we met at DK because we both used to work in the library. She was a the next grade below me, and we both used to work in the library. So this is how we struck up a friendship, but not a relationship at
the time. Yes.
Yes, and then she went. Her father moved to Kitwe. He used to work for Zesco, and he moved to look after power stuff in Kitwe. So she moved to Mpelembe, and we lost track.
Yeah.
But we reconnected at the University of Zambia.
Okay. No, wonderful. Yes. Small tidbits like that are very important. Tell us, you are now at Harvard.
I am now at. So this is. I make the application. I make the application, and then they call me for an interview. It was a Zoom interview like this, with a panel of professors, and surprisingly, I was very confident, and they asked a couple of questions. I need to write them, and then this is how they gave me the offer, and then a 3-year appointment as a postdoctoral research fellow. Now, a postdoctoral research fellow, Ambassador Mwamba, is what happens is often when people finish their PhD, they go for what is called a postdoctoral, post your PhD. Correct. To go and concretize your ideas. Remember, at the PhD level, you've made some arguments. Yeah. Some of those arguments might require a little more fine-tuning. Also, they would like for you to convert arguments into published articles. Journal articles, scientific articles. So the postdoc is very nice because it gives you this time. You're not a PhD student, a member of staff. You're in between. So they've created time for you to write, to publish, and then after you've done this, you can go up for an academic job. So that was essentially. So I went for the postdoc. So I arrived in Boston, and Harvard is located in Boston, Massachusetts, specifically in a town called Cambridge, which is really just an extension of Boston. So pretty much. Yeah. I arrived in Boston in January of 2016. I have to take up my post, which I did for 2 years. It's supposed to be a 3-year appointment, but I did it for 2 years because the University of Cape Town, my old university, came calling. So they kept calling again. And
That
said,
we have work for you here. We've got an appointment for you.
We've got an appointment for you at the business school. And you know, University of Cape Town's business school is one of the best business schools in the world. So
Yeah, correct.
It's, in fact, the best business school in the continent, and easily one of the top 100 or 150 business schools in the world. So they kept calling to help for me, you know, faculty appointment ready for me. And you know, academic jobs are not easy, especially permanent jobs. They were offering me a permanent job. You know, and at the time, now I had gotten married. Once and I had gotten married, and we were expecting our first child. Our first child was on the way.
So the adventure of academics was no longer that interesting. You needed a job that can root you down.
I needed a job that could root me down, that could promise me a salary perpetually. You know, we did the calculation, we did the discussion, we consulted, and we accepted the offer that the University of Cape Town advanced. So I left Harvard at the end of 2017. So 2016, 2017, I'm at Harvard. I left Harvard at the end of 2017 to move back to Cape Town, this time as a faculty member, as a member of the teaching staff. So the position of senior lecturer, economics. And I was at the business school for 3 years, 2018, 2019, and 2020. This doesn't paint a picture of a restless wanderer, always traveling, always moving. So 2018, 2019, and 2020, Ambassador Mwamba was at the business school. And then sometime in 2020, at somewhere in the middle of 2020, towards 2020, I got an email inquiry from a very distinguished professor of economics in the US. His name is Derek Hamilton. He's of economics at the New School. The New School is a university in New York City, a very well-known, left-leaning, radical university in New York. And he was setting up a new research center. And he was inviting me to join him as director of research for this new research in New York City. So starting 2021, so up to I left UCT.
No, just wait there. What attracted you to an institute or a research institution like that? Like you've stated, the US is right-leaning, capitalistic in nature. But of course, there's an evolving, strong debate in the US to think that I think their policies have been far to the right. And was maybe your training at the University of Zambia rooted you more to left economic policies?
Thanks, Ambassador Mwamba. I hope you can hear me. We had a little bit of a break at some point. Okay, but I think I heard the gist of your question. What attracted me to a place like that? I think you summed it up very well. Left-leaning places of study in the US are rare and few and far between because, like they put it, the US is very capitalist in its ideology and orientation. So this is what attracted me to this new institute, because Professor Derek Hamilton was going to take issues of inequality seriously. He was going to take issues of the role of public policy, in reducing inequalities seriously, the role of the state in reducing inequality, eliminating poverty seriously. As you know, in the US, a long time, and you're right, it is changing now, but for a long time, the debate has been, or the logic or the ideology has been, if you're poor, Ambassador, it's your fault. Forget the color of your skin, forget your gender, forget the history that your people arrived as slaves here, right? Forget, that you were unfortunate enough to be born in a family that didn't have, forget all those things, but you're poor because it's Professor Ham Research Institute was turning this on its head. We create poverty based on the policies that we as a state or as a government. Or as
the state has a role to play in the development of the country.
Massive role. So this really attracted me to this research institute. And so I moved to New York City. Now, I
Back.
maintained a home back to the US, but I was shut in New York City and because Mwansa wanted, she was doing some farming in Lusaka and to grow farming business. And we had some other projects that we were trying to complete in Lusaka. Lusaka is our hometown. Both she and I were both born in Lusaka. So we
Yeah.
have a massive affinity for Lusaka. So I go back and forth between New York City and Lusaka. So I worked with Professor Hamilton for 3 years, 2021, 2022, 2020. Seems like 3 is the magic number. I hope it's not. In the third year, Mr. Mwamba, working with Professor Hamilton, I got another email inquiry, this time from the UAE, here in the Gulf region. And basically, this inquiry said the ruler of the Emirate of Sharjah. Now, as you know, Ambassador Mwamba, and as viewers know, Arab Emirates is made up of 7 emirates.
Yeah.
They're the well-known ones are Dubai and Abu Dhabi. Those are the well-known ones. Most people know those ones. But there is also others. And the third one is called Sharjah, the Emirate of Sharjah. And the ruler of Sharjah, and each one of the emirates has a ruler, in Dubai is Sheikh Al Maktoum. Most people know, they probably seen faces of him. In Abu Dhabi is Sheikh Zayed, Mohammed bin Zayed, sometimes said MBZ, who also happens to be the president of the UAE. So the ruler of Abu Dhabi automatically becomes the president of the UAE, right? So
what role do the other emirates have? How is the devolved structure beneficial? Because that's something we can learn from, actually.
That's true. You're right. It's almost like, I think the best equivalent is the federal system in the US. It is quite like the federal system in the US, where you have each state is run by a governor, and a lot of power and authority is devolved to the states, right? But there is a federal government. And, things, exactly, the federal government comes in when there are federal issues. Issues are decided at the local level, at the state and local level. So it's the same with the UAE. So the different emirates are the equivalent of different states. And each is a ruler. But the 7 rulers make up what is called the Supreme Council of Rulers, which meets
where the president of...
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, where exactly right, Ambassador Mwamba, where the ruler of Abu Dhabi is the chairperson of that council, or Supreme Council of Rulers. So, but each one of these emirates and each one of these rulers has a unique personality, which filters through into how their
state policies
are run. State policies. For example, the ruler of Sharjah, who's actually the longest running, he's been ruler since the 70s. The ruler of Sharjah has an affinity for education and culture and the arts. So he sets up universities. That is his passion. He sets up universities. And he sets up museums. So if you come to Sharjah, Ambassador Mwamba, I hope you visit me.
At your invitation.
Anytime, you're welcome to visit me. And so he set up a 2018 called the Africa Institute, specifically dedicated to the study, research, and teaching of Africa and its diaspora. Now, you might ask, why did he set up a university called the Africa Institute?
Because why is it important?
Why is it important? So in 1976, the ruler of Sharjah convened a very big conference of African and Arabs, Afro-Arab Solidarity Conference here in Sharjah. By the way, Kenneth Kaunda was invited, and he sent one of his most distinguished diplomats. I've forgotten the name of this diplomat, but I'll remember, because this diplomat gave a keynote address on behalf of President Kaunda. That address is very memorable. I will share that just shows you that just like you, Ambassador Mwamba, who's been a stellar diplomat, a distinguished diplomat, we've also had some and stellar distinguished diplomats in Zambia's history. True. So, an outcome of this Afro-Arab meeting of 1976 was to set up an institute that takes Africa seriously and also fosters Afro-Arab solidarity, which is very important, as you can imagine. Very important. I mean, we have a history of Afro-Arab solidarity. Talk about Muammar Gaddafi. You can talk about Gamal Abdel Nasser, first president of Egypt, and the list on. And we've always had Ahmed Ben Bella of Algeria, the first president of Algeria, for which we have a road named in Lusaka, Ben Bella Road. So we've got a very long history of Afro-Arab solidarity. As you know, Yasser Arafat, I'm sure for a long time thought about Lusaka as a place where he could seek refuge. So this institute was born out of that recognition, right? So this institute, one of our primary responsibilities is to foster Afro-Arab dialogue and Afro-Arab solidarity and Afro-Arab friendship through research, through teaching, through service. So in 2023, I got an email from the founding director of this institute, Professor Salah Hassan, a distinguished art history who has taught at Cornell and all these places. And he asked me to join him. And he said, we're looking for an economist on the faculty, economist. And people have said, I should speak with you. So I'd like to offer you a position of associate professor of political economy. You take it. So obviously, talked with Mwansa about it. We came to visit. We saw what was at offer, because now our family is growing. We have 2 children, so we were very much concerned about are there facilities to support the family and all. So Mwansa likes it. I have no choice but to like it as well. So,
of course, that's what we do as men. All we do is to save our families.
I'm telling you. So I then left the New York job in September. I gave my notice of 2023, and then in September of 2023, we all moved here, and we've been here since. So it's not even a year yet, as you can imagine. So we are settling, and we are hoping certainly it's going to be more than 3 years, because 3 seems to be the magic number. But
well, you are young and you're still, growing your career. So don't apologize for being a nomad. You are building up all these experiences. They will, yield fruits in future. Let's come to the crack of it. And, that background you gave was very important because of what we are going to discuss. Zambia at 60 this year. This is what we are celebrating. There's a centenary for Dr. Kaunda, our founding president. But when you look at our country in 1964, when we started this journey, we were a wealthy country, middle-income country, with some form of growing middle class. We're actually wealthier than many states that have now become far richer. 60 years later, we are a poor country, one of the 20 poorest countries in the world. For me, that's a very sad story. Where did we go wrong? What policies did we foster, or what circumstances have led us to this? So I'll invite you immediately to begin to review our presidents and their policies and their mistakes and what they could have done better. Let's start with our founding president, Dr. Kenneth David Kaunda.
I mean, this is a tall order, but it is one of those areas of our countries which is, I think, little discussed, little researched, and little interacted with. So I think I see this as a beginning of a conversation and a dialogue, and I hope one of the viewers who's interested in matters of research around economic policy begin to think about, maybe a master's dissertation, PhD thesis, or a BA thesis in as economic history. So let's start with Dr. Kaunda. By the way, and you did say it, we're celebrating his 100th birthday. He's a personal hero of mine. I greatly admire him. I had the fortune to be born in the last 8 years he's president. So the one thing that I think I admire about Dr. Kaunda, Ambassador Mwamba, is that he was very proud. People like to think about Dr. Kaunda as an ideologue. I think he had an ideology of humanism, which is the person at the center of everything, at the center of state policy, at the center of society. His ideology was humanism. He was a humanist in the sense Kaunda loved human beings. And I think most people like to quote, he always reminded us about a commandment that tells, love your neighbor as you love yourself. This was vintage Kaunda. Every opportunity he had was to remind us to love our neighbors. So pragmatic, but not an ideologue insofar as economic policy is concerned. And I'll explain why in a second. When we got independent British in 1964, Zambia, and most people forget this, Zambia was really a private run sector, almost one may say, run economy.
We're a multi-party state. The private sector ran the economy up to 80%.
You're very right. And our mines, the crown jewels, were in the hands of American Metal, Climax, and Anglo-American. So we were a private sector run economy, and like you've rightly, 80% of the economy was in the hands of private sector. So Kaunda genuinely was advised that is the best to organize Zambia's economy, and this is the best way to guarantee the mobility of, because at independence, Kaunda and his friends inherited a highly unequal Zambia and inequalities that were on racial lines, right? So obviously they were in a hurry to fix these inequalities. They were in a hurry to make sure more Zambians were educated, more Zambians had opportunities in the economy, to assure and guarantee the upward mobility of Zambians in the shortest space of time. At 64, Kaunda believed this couldn't be done by the private sector, or at least he was advised. But the man was very pragmatic, and it's important to understand, to be pragmatic as a leader, not to be an ideologue, but to be pragmatic. So a very interesting story is told. I don't know who told me this story, but I think somebody did tell me that he paid a visit to one of the mines. This is in the early periods, first year or two after independence. And he found out that this mine, at the managerial level, was mostly white expatriates, right? And this was 2 years or 3 years into independence. And he asked, when can I expect at least indigenous Zambians, part of why we fought for, to share in management of affairs in the economy, when can I expect, he asked the people who were giving him a tour of this mine, when can we expect Zambians to take up positions of leadership in these mines? And the one of the white expatriate staff responded and said, it will be difficult to grow a critical mass of indigenous Zambians to take up managerial positions before the year 2001. This is 1967. This is 1967.
Almost, he's saying it will take 50 years.
It will take 50 years. And this is the thing with private sector. Private sector can tell you lies. They can spin a story which you can convince. I'm not against private sector. I like to believe the role of government is to set the terms, set the scene, set the pace, and private sector should follow. Not the other way around. Private sector, the old American expression, private sector should not wag dog. Dog should wag private sector. Should be the tail. So we should, that kind of thing. President Kaunda games, right? They're really playing games with us. And Ambassador Mwamba, I hope I'm still there and you can hear me loud and clear.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. So private sector, Dr. Kaunda immediately realizes that private sector games. And also there are some statistics that back him, right? And this, by the way, is work that has been done by Professor Oliver Sasa in the 80s when he did some amazing work in the 80s. He wrote about the experience of Kaunda and private sector in the initial years of independence. So, for example, phenomenal work, some phenomenal work which I've learned a lot from. Kaunda begins to realize that these private sector people are externalizing all the profits. Before independence, when the British were running affairs, private sector was reinvesting in the Zambian economy. After independence, the rate of profits increased manifold, right? The banks, for example, the banks were just giving loans to the white expatriate class. So essentially, private sector was
sabotaging the
engaged in
state.
sabotaging the state, and in a sense, not playing ball with the aspirations of the state,
Of
the
the
new
country.
Zambian country, and that kind of thing, right? So Kenneth realized, this is a problem. If I continue on this path, it will be 40 years, 50 years, and Zambia will continue being an enclave economy where a small minority that's mostly white lives a great life, and the great majority of Zambians are shut out outside, right? So this is why I say Dr. Kaunda was a pragmatist. He gave private sector a chance. You see,
Yeah.
64, he gives them a chance. He observes their and then immediately changes course. This is also important when we come back to the 1980s. When you remember Ambassador Mwamba, when he gave the IMF a chance,
Yeah.
and then he reversed course. Remember when he chased them away? This is what Dr. Kaunda
We
was.
put out of the IMF.
Yes, after the results showed. So I don't see Dr. Kaunda as an ideologue.
Okay.
You know, like, was he a socialist? Was he a capitalist? I think Dr. Kaunda was a pragmatist. I think he's a that of humanism. At the end of the day, he thought about, right? But he gave, okay, let me give this capitalist private sector thing a chance. So this thing failed. And as you know now, in 1969, a country was first the Mulungushi reforms or the Material Declaration. But I think in 68, reforms where the non-mining sector is nationalized. At least a considerable chunk of it is nationalized. And then in 69 was the Material where he announced the nationalization of the mines, right? The mines were nationalized. Now, one which is worth reminding us about here is that most people, when they think about nationalization, they think about an outright takeover. You know, you just expropriate without compensation. You know, you take over and you don't compensate. Again, it's quite similar to the Mopani deal with the PF. You know, the PF took over Mopani, but essentially,
but they paid for it.
They paid for it, exactly.
Or pledged to pay for it.
Or pledged to pay for it. And with Dr. Kaunda in 1969. And this is why most people need to understand this very subtle point. So in 69, and Simon Zukas, I think in one of his books, has written quite eloquently and very clearly about this period, and it's worth hearing about. So Dr. Kaunda was advised to not expropriate without compensation. You know, what you should do is you should pay off the old owners of the mines. You know, imagine this, Ambassador Mwamba, the old owners, American Metal Climax and Anglo American, who did they pay to get the rights to the mines?
No one. But we had to pay them these millions of dollars
to get our mines back. So to do that, we had to issue bonds, quite like
the
Euro
Zimco bonds.
Zimco bonds, exactly. So we took out Zimco bonds, which were, in my estimation and my calculation, completely mispriced. So I think some of the people who were advising the Zambian government at the time overvalued the mines, specifically because they wanted to make sure that whatever, I think it was a 49% stake, because the Zambian government had bought a 51% stake. So they wanted to make sure that that 51% stake was very exaggerated. So we took out Zimco bonds. And part of the thing, I think Dr. Kaunda was misadvised. Simon Zuka says at the center of the misadvice was a guy called Tiny Rowland, some British businessman.
Entrepreneur in Africa. And he made a lot of money here in Zambia and Southern Rhodesia.
Yeah, with his loan. I think he was the proprietor behind Lonro Motors, I imagine. Lonro Motors and things. Anyway, so we issued these costly Zimco bonds to buy a 51% stake in our mines, at least to get a controlling stake in our mines. And in my own estimation and in my own work, I think the debt, remember the debt that then crippled Zambia much later on, would be...
Beginning 1973.
1973, which had to be forgiven with HIPIC, you know, this debt is very much related to the issue of taking a majority stake in our mines, which is very painful. right? Most people think the debt was a result of mismanagement by the KK government. A big debt. There is some mismanagement. There's always mismanagement. Even in Coca-Cola, even in the Ford Motor Company, there's mismanagement. But with that particular debt, a very big chunk of it was we just took out costly debt to gain back our dignity, which is so painful.
True. When I read about it, in fact, I called it one of the worst corruption in our country. I stated that we first listed them at the London Stock Exchange. And I think for one reason or another, I think a year later, in 1971 or so, we had to buy those bonds back, and at a cost of over $250 million. Now, that in current terms, those are billions. So what I suspect is Tyne Roland walks away with these millions of dollars after we bought back those Zimco bonds.
Essentially. So you're exactly right. And I imagine there was, when we had listed them on the London Stock Exchange, I imagine there was an issue of maybe the interest payments were so much, and maybe somebody did say, to control these interest payments, buy these bonds back, buy them so that you owe yourselves. When you own the bond, you're really owing yourself, in a sense. So, and I'm sure, again, they were overpriced, and we ended up paying dearly. And to raise, I imagine we probably had to go somewhere else to be able to, to buy these bonds back. So
I agree with you. The economy begins to leak with such a huge amount. I think by the time the 1973, crisis is coming, we are probably weak from the fiscal point of view.
You're right. And another very important point is people, the decade 1960 to 1969, Ambassador Mwamba, is a decade of prices very well. Very, very well. The real price of copper, I think, in that decade goes up by about 60 or 70% in that decade alone. Expectation that copper prices were going to continue doing very well. So I imagine part of the calculation that the counter administration is performing is, okay, these are very costly bonds. We've had to buy them back. We've had to take out debt to buy them back. We've got costly outlays that are coming up, but copper will continue doing very well. Copper will continue doing very well. But unfortunately for us, starting about 1970 and 1971, copper begins a 3-decade line. In real terms, so in inflation-adjusted terms, the price of copper, Ambassador Mwamba, declines for 3 decades straight. Wow. 3 decades, it recovered, but it declines by about 70% from between 1970 and 1999. So on the one hand, the counters, imagine this balancing act. And they have all this costly debt that they've taken out, and then the shocks begin to happen, like you said.
And we have the heavy reliance on our mines.
We have a heavy reliance on our mines, and also there's all these liberation wars that are being fought in our midst. At some point it becomes very difficult to get crude oil through the port of Durban, so we had to airlift some of that stuff as we are waiting for Tazama and all this stuff to happen on this other side. So a lot is going on. The immense amount of stress and complexity and dynamics that the KK administration had to deal with, I come to terms with it. It is even a miracle that we're able to, it's a going concern. Things were, but at the same time, infrastructure late. Infrastructure that has come to benefit many of us. The university is being built, hospitals are being upgraded or built, towns are being upgraded or built, roads are being upgraded or built. If things are still happening in the midst of all this complexity that's going on. So we have a first oil shock in 73. I'm sure this has a huge fiscal knock on us. I think there's another oil shock in the late 70s, another massive distances us in a great deal. And then remember, we've taken out some debt. That debt is obviously indexed in US dollars. It's US dollar denominated debt. So it's very sensitive to what the Federal Reserve System is doing in the US. In the late 70s and early 80s, the US is trying to fight inflation. So they get a central banker called Paul Volcker. And Volcker, it's called the Volcker shock. So Volcker raises US interest rates very steeply to control inflation there. We have debt that's dollar denominated. We have had to borrow it, obviously, for the same coupons. We've had to borrow it, I'm sure, to deal with the two oil price shocks. We probably have had to borrow some of it to deal with all the stuff that's going with liberation wars and the impacts on our economy, right? With the expectation that copper prices will recover. There's a very famous chart, by the way, that I'll share with you, Ambassador Mwamba. At this time, the World Bank and the IMF advising Zambia, and don't worry, copper prices will recover. Copper prices will recover. Anyways, so the Volcker shock comes in the early 80s as Paul Volcker in the US is trying to control inflation. And then what happens? This sends our economy into a tailspin because now we can't afford to pay our debts. It becomes pretty clear in the early 80s that we
can't meet crisis. The cost of our imports.
We can't meet the cost of our. We've got what is called a balance of payments crisis. We have a problem with copper. Copper is not bringing in enough dollars. We have all this dollar-denominated debt that is outstanding. We've got all these imports. So we get into a crisis. And that's, I think, the first time we approached the IMF for an IMF program, I think in 84. I'm sure, I don't know who was the Minister of Finance at the time, but I'm sure they wrote a letter of intent to the IMF, asked for assistance. And we get on an IMF program in 84. As you know, this IMF program, as always happens with IMF programs, produces much more pain. It makes the patient more sick. It doesn't help the patient, it makes the patient more sick. So in 88, Kaunda, this is when he brings this homegrown, we call it a homegrown recovery plan. I've forgotten what he called it, but it chases away the IMF, and he decides to say we shall begin to use our own resources to try to develop. And there's some very interesting things that happen in this period. I'm young, but I was also observant, and I can remember it. I've read about it, but there's some experimentation on the level of industry. We've got Tarino, Tip Top. We've got some.
We remember we're at the crisis of US dollars. We have full-fledged foreign exchange controls, and there's a queue of people trying to, access dollars. So government began to promote import substitute. What can we manufacture here than import? Tarino is those examples you are giving, Tip Top and others.
Yes, yeah. And you know what is a real pity, Mwamba? When you come and tell me the real pity is that we stopped this experimentation, we cut it short. Because everybody who's developed, as recently, has developed by a process called learning by doing. Whether it is China, whether it is Japan, whether it is South Korea, they've had to experiment. Initially, their products are not great, but my recollection is that Tip Top and Tarino went very bad, actually. But the point was that this process of learning by doing, this process of experimentation was cut short. I wish it had gone. Imagine today, Tip Top and Tarino would have been very big brands. They would have the risk development, the nutritionists would have improved them. They would be possibly some of our biggest exports. Anyways, so this period of self-reliance is cut very short. By 1991, President Kaunda is voted out of power. The crisis just becomes so grave that people begin to ask questions about the viability of KK as a leader. And he is sort of kicked out. But I hope the story I've told about KK gives a sense of the complexity of the challenges. Often we're very, very... we're very dismissive. We try.
There are people that have stated that probably should have stepped back and allowed another to take over. The Kaunda era were very good at getting us independence, promoting national unity, and also fostering this patriotism. But probably when it came to the complexity, maybe they were overwhelmed. But looking at the challenges, maybe Dr. Kaunda didn't feel that there was anyone as loyal to the country as who could sacrifice and be president amidst those challenges. That remains an open question to answer. Let's move to Dr. Frederick Chiluba and the return to multi-party state, and then we foster this liberal economy. Dr. Kaunda had taken it far to the left. The IMF had tried to make him to reduce the footprint of state-owned enterprises, but that floundered, that IMF program floundered like you just explained. So it's now implemented full throttle by the new government. Just speak to the government of Frederick Chilua.
And before I speak about Dr. Chilua, I want to just say one last thing about Kaunda. Remember the objective, one of the objectives in 64 was to encourage the upward mobility of Zambians, to ensure that there was a Zambian middle class, to ensure that there was a Zambian professional managerial class that could run the universities, that could run the mines, that could run industries. By 1991, he had achieved it in record time. In fact, by 1980, I'm sure the university must have had an indigenous vice chancellor. I'm sure the University of Zambia must have had indigenous professors. I'm sure the mine, by that time, now it had become Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, I think by 80 or 81. I'm sure that the mines, remember the predictions of the white expatriate class that not
who said you needed up to 50 years.
Yes. But I think it's also important for viewers to realize that in terms of creating a middle class, in terms of mobility, in terms of creating a Zambian professional managerial class, Dr. Kaunda succeeded. And this is important when we begin to think about our present.
It's a great milestone for our country.
Actually, in record time, if you think about the struggles, for example, in South Africa, Ambassador Mwamba, where you and I have lived before, and the struggles, they've been struggling with this issue. This is the
30 years later, after they became self-governing, they're still struggling with that.
They're still struggling with the issue of creating a space for the majority black population in different sections, in the commanding heights of the economy, whether it be in the universities, in industry, and so on and so forth. So Dr. Kaunda very quickly, and it is, in my estimation, it is not a surprise, it's not an accident. I think we allow a large role for the state in the economy. This happens. Remember what I said at the beginning. The state should wag the tail, which is the tail is private sector, not private sector wagging. This is where we get it from. Anyways, so let's come to Dr. Frederick Chilua, who I know you worked for very closely, who I know you have got a great amount of respect. So Dr. Chilua arrives in 91. And obviously, it's an economy that is at its knees, given all this we have said. Partly the result of mismanagement, but I think largely the result of external things beyond Dr. Kaunda and his administration's control. Things that are happening external. Anyways, so inherits this which is on its knees. And Dr. Chilua,
a huge debt of $7 billion.
Huge debt of $7 billion.
And by the way, I've seen people compare that debt of $7 billion in 1990-91 and the debt of about $11 billion in 2021. Probably you come to speak to that. But at that stage, our economy was a small economy. I think it was a $3 billion economy while having a foreign debt of $7 billion.
Yeah, I mean, you're very right, Ambassador Mwamba. This $7 billion, even in 2021 terms, I think it's a huge number. If you bring $7 billion in 1991 and you bring it to what $7 billion means in 2021 terms, it's a huge number. So this was a huge debt. It was a huge crippling debt. The economy was on its knees, but it's also important to understand the theories that were very fashionable in economics at the time. Right? The theories that were very fashionable in economics at the time were theories that in many ways castigated the state, right? So taking a course in economics, you were the reason why many of these African countries have found themselves in states of crisis is because their states, their bureaucracies have been too big. They've had a massive role in the economy. Dr. Chilua used to say there's no business for government in business. What was his expression? How he used to say it? Government
has no business in business. That was a mantra that was promoted by the Economist at the time to reduce the role of the state in the economy.
The role of the state. Yes, and we've now learned, and by the way, it is not Dr. Chilua. because a leader listens to advice. Say, okay, the best economists, what should we do? We have this crisis. But it was a mixed diagnosis, because we now know, with hindsight, with the luxury of history, it's always easy to learn to look at the past, and we now know with the advantage of hindsight that that was a diagnosis. Essentially, the misdiagnosis was that the reason why Zambia and many other countries like Zambia were in a crisis was because of the state. The state was too big. The state was too present in the economy. So the solution was to liquidate the state, make it small. This is what structural adjustment was. Structure adjust your economies in such a way that the state becomes small, and then private sector will magically flourish. It was a misdiagnosis. We now know.
Correct.
Because the crisis that caused Zambia's crisis was mostly external factors. The price of coal for a very long period of time. There were massive oil price shocks. There was a VOCA shock that I talked about, the raising of interest rates in the US. These were the fundamental causes of Zambia's crisis. Approximate cause was maybe mismanagement, but fundamentally, this was the cause. So the misdiagnosis led to a wrong policy. Liquidate the state.
Wrong medicine.
Which is what? Wrong medicine. Exactly. Somebody is suffering from a stomach pain, you give them medicine to treat some other part of the body, right? You've misdiagnosed it. And therefore given a wrong medicine. So structural adjustment was a wrong medicine for the wrong type of crisis. And this is why, but I don't blame Dr. Chelwa, because any leader who had come into office in 1991, very likely
would have implemented the same policy. In fact, all leaders that came subsequent to Dr. Chelwa across Africa were given the same diagnosis and prescription. And Doc, you teach this because we became deindustrialized. We had a huge manufacturing and industrial sector. We're only comparable to South Africa and Salisbury, Zimbabwe at the time. At the end of that process from the IMF, we're deindustrialized. The copper belt towns like Ndola, Kitwe became quiet. The Lusaka light industrial area became quiet. And the few surviving state-owned enterprises were literally limping.
Correct. So exactly. So this misdiagnosis led to exactly what you said, Ambassador Mwamba. And one thought that occurred to me as you were speaking, and it escaped me. Exactly. It's important to realize, yes, this is the point. Now, it is true that the best, in inverted commas, the best advice at the time said to Dr. Chelwa and his cabinet that they should enter into this structural adjustment program with the IMF, reduce the role of the state in the economy, right? Privatize all state-owned enterprises. It is true. But it's also important to understand, which also brings back to this present moment, there was debate. Even in his cabinet, there were some people who opposed this. And even in Zambian society, there was some organizations around it, against it. Some academics stood up to write, oh, this is going to cause pain, which is also very important. I think it's also very important that as we craft policy, we are as consultative, as widely consultative as we can be, right? Which is also similar to how we have arrived on an IMF program to date, right? Often often there was no consultation. It's mostly the people in Washington who are dictating the terms. Similarly, this happened at the time, right? Even though there was some dissent, but that dissent to flourish. In a sense, there was some disagreement. That disagreement did not filter into its national debate about which way for the economy, right? Given all
the alternative was, Doc, was highly scandalized. Look, the beacon of hope for left policies like the Soviet Unions were collapsing left, right, and center. And so that view, alternative to the liberal policy, was scandalized. In fact, people would rather whisper because it appeared clearly that it was a failed policy.
Yes, it appeared at the time, although we now know that it was actually a wrong misdiagnosis. But it was very difficult for you to, confidently and say the way to grow an economy, the way to develop a country is to have a non-trivial a major role, a non-trivial role for the state, a major role for the state in the economy, because the Soviet Union had collapsed. The famous, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama wrote, "This is the end of history. The Western liberal model has triumphed."
Yeah.
That history now ends. This is what Fukuyama said. So you're very right.
I had the privilege to meet Professor Fukuyama in Johannesburg. He came to sell his new book. And I asked him that question. Do you regret? Were you too quick to close, the space of history? Because he assumed the liberal policy would dominate the world and would never go back to any other policy other than the neoliberal policies.
Correct. You're very right. I think he would say that he was too hasty in his conclusion, so you're very right. So this is the 90s, and it is remarkable the number of state-owned enterprises that were privatized at this period. The state was completely rolled back from any role in the economy. The state was completely rolled back from the substantive provision of social services, substantive provision of education, and so on and so forth. Really, in my estimation, the 90s, major part of the 90s were a lost decade. Clearly a lost decade. The economy wasn't doing very well.
Other of your economists, when they review the state of our economy now, they say, despite that pain, we probably laid the foundation of where we can go, because we had tested the far left socialist policies. We are then gone to the right, and somehow we've been wavering in between.
I mean, I think the correct policy is not extreme. It's useful to think about the pragmatism of Dr. Kaunda that I spoke about at the beginning. I think our policy should really be pragmatic, dictated by conditions on the ground as they exist, dictated by data, in a sense, dictated by what is happening. We should not be shy to change our minds and change course when the situation allows it. But this idea about that the 90s laid the ground for the success that came later is not true. Now, success for some, and this is also important to relate it to the mass mobility, upward mobility of the Kaunda era. Upward mobility stopped in our country starting 1990s. In 1960, 1970, and parts of 1980, it didn't matter who you were, Ambassador Mwamba. You could start life in 1968 or 1973 at cattle herder, somewhere like Ngandu Magande. If you've read his book, he starts life as a cattle herder. Yes, right.
And end up as Minister of Finance.
Yes, and these stories are not few, rare. More will tell you, this is how I started my life, and I ended up here, I ended up there. There was mass upward mobility in the KK days. That kind of mobility, Ambassador Mwamba, has stopped, in my estimation, starting 1990. It is who you know. It is the networks. It is now, the mobility is really networked type of mobility. The chances of somebody, a youngster today, who's born in a very poor part of Zambia, in a far-flung poor part of Zambia, ending up like Ngandu Magande, is far, far rare. That chance is far, far smaller today than it was. So it might have laid the groundwork for some dynamism in the economy, but dynamism for a few. And this is a period where we see inequality also going up. This is a period where inequality also begins to, and begins to be pronounced. So this is the 1990s, in my opinion, pretty much a lost decade.
Let's go to President Mwamba.
Chilua, you work closely with him. He meant well, but I think his economic policy was a creature of the circumstance. Prevailing ideology in economics. Unfortunately, the Soviet Union had collapsed, like you were saying. So it was a very, very difficult time to defend the state in that era.
Let's go to President Mwamba.
Yes, we had a conversation, we have a different conversation. Okay, so President Mwamba comes along. Again, President Mwamba, in my estimation, is like a leader of the KK mode in the sense of pragmatism. in the sense of pragmatism, in the sense of like forming economic policy not on ideological grounds, but really forming economic policy as the facts present themselves. So I think President Mwanawasa wins in December 2001 is the election. He takes office in January of 2002. And I'm sure he can see some of the harm that has happened in the 1990s. I mean, there's a reason why I think he had 28% of the vote. I mean, he had what? He had probably like what?
Yes, he came up as a minority president.
Yeah, minority president. And he knew this. So it was a vote against the MMD, essentially. The majority voted against. Whereas in 1991, the MMD had 75% of the vote. It's a huge.
And in 2001, over 70% voted against him.
Against them. So he could see this. So the economic policy of the 1990s had caused pain. So I think this begins to influence how he begins to think about economic policy. And then obviously one of the conversations is, what did we do wrong in the 90s? There was a complete liquidation of the state. For example, the state completely came out of agriculture. The state completely removed itself from agriculture. No subsidies to agriculture, no marketing subsidies. NAMBOD had been liquidated. Lima Bank had been liquidated. So the state completely divorced itself from agriculture. So I think it's no accident that he asks Ngandu Magande to be his Minister of Finance, right? Ngandu Magande is somebody who grew up in the Kaunda days, in the Kaunda administration. If you read Ngandu Magande's book, it's replete with examples of the kind of planning that is taking place, the kind of economic policy, that takes upward mobility seriously, that's taking place in the Kaunda days. So he taps Ngandu Magande to be his Minister of Finance, and I imagine one of the first responsibilities is to sort out the debt issue, right? So Zambia now gets put on a HIPIC program so that our debt could be written off. I think that's probably one of the first things in Magande's entry. And then also one remarkable thing happened. This is also interesting what Mwanawasa does with MMD. I think he moves the MMD from extreme right to somewhere almost left of center.
In the center.
He moves it to the center. So for example, they launched at the time called Fertilizer Support Program.
The FISP program.
FSP, which has now become the FISP. Right? It was initially called Fertilizer Support Program, and then became Farmer Input Support Program. But it's launched in 2002, 2003, because there's a drought. If you remember, 2001 is a drought.
Yeah.
And people are eating rice and all those kinds of things. And I think one of the outcomes of that analysis was, okay, droughts happen, but where are the maize stocks? Well, the maize stocks are not there because in the 1990s, the government completely divorced itself from supporting agriculture, right? So anyway, so they launched the FISP, which in my estimation has been incredibly successful, Ambassador Mwamba, in turning Zambia from a net importer of maize into of maize. Incredibly successful in many ways. Obviously, HIPIC completion point is arrived at in sometime in 2005. So we get a very clean break. The economy is doing well. Also importantly is that copper prices begin to recover. And unfortunately for us, copper prices begin to recover when we've privatized the mines. Now, I don't know if you're a suspicious man. I'm not a suspicious man, but the coincidence is striking.
It's repeating itself. There's scramble for the mines, and there's a prediction during the time all the mines will be owned by the private sector, the copper price may rise up to $12,000, up to $20,000. You cannot ignore the conspiracy.
That's true. It's very difficult to ignore it. So copper prices recover. Between 2002 and 2012, my own calculation, I think, says the recovery is about 200% in real terms. Copper prices go up by about 200% in real terms. Actually, helps the Mwanawasa administration along, and then the economy begins to grow at about between 7 and 10% per annum in this period. Right? Copper prices are doing
the highest in the last 30 years.
Yeah, our debt has been forgiven. A very steady hand, but who also understands that the role of the finance is not just catering to the IMF and World Bank, catering to private sector, but most importantly is catering to the Zambian people.
Ngandu Magande introduces windfall tax on the on the tax on the profits of the mines.
There you have it. See what I'm saying when I say that Mwanawasa takes, and maybe this is Magande, I don't know who we should attribute this to, but he takes the MMD from very much right-leaning to the center, to pragmatism, in my own estimation. The universities are running very well. I mean, entering the university, I finished my degree in record time with a bursary. Many other people around me have bursaries, so things are really going well. I mean, the 2000s are a really good time for Zambia, a really good time for all these reasons that I've articulated. And I think the most important thing is policy, economic policy that is steady, that is pro-poor, that sees the poor. Imagine just arriving and saying we're going to subsidize maize growing. Very, very difficult for that to have happened in the 90s, for example. So this is now...
President Mwanawasa dies in office. We have Rupia Banda who comes, and there I'm sad because the new Minister of Finance, Honorable Msokotwane, is Tumbeko Msokotwane, abolishes windfall tax, something that had earned the Zambian government up to around $600 million in 2008 alone.
You're very right. So again, the role, this is why, it matters who's Minister of Finance and their ideology and how they see the world. Magande saw the world differently. Magande, Dr. Msokotwane, as I understand it, entered the Ministry of Finance in 1978. I think he started working there. So, but for some reason, Ngandu Magande I think Ngandu Magande saw this kind of humanism aspect of KK. But anyways, Dr. Msokotwane saw the world ideologically different. Dr. Msokotwane saw the world as a world where private sector is important. Private sector is always given the advantages. So like you are saying, he takes away the windfall tax. I haven't looked closely. I have no idea how the economy is performing in years. But I know there's a slight dip in copper prices somewhere there. But be that as it may, the Banda reign is a very short one. It's very difficult. Aside from like where you say Dr. Msokotwane takes away the windfall tax, it's very difficult for one to sort of tell a story about economic policy in the Banda years.
The economy actually then continues, I think, with a push from Magande and, with no debt at all. It continues to grow. In fact, it's in 2010 that we migrate to become a low middle income country. And then, your friends, the IMF, even usher us to the markets that we should go to Eurobonds.
That's true. And this is an important point. The thing around borrowing from the Eurobonds, borrowing from capital markets, this thinking really starts in the last stages of the government. Under the stewardship of Dr. Msokotwane and I think Dr. Fundanga at the central bank, they begin the process of getting Zambia a Fitch rating. Right? They begin because for you to borrow from the capital markets, you've got to get a Fitch rating. You've got to get a sovereign rating as a country. So, but this process doesn't start with Michael Sata. It starts with Dr. Msokotwane, overseen by Dr. Msokotwane and Dr. Fundanga, because we get the Fitch rating sometime in 2012. Anyway, so Mr. Rupia Banda loses the election. And it's also important, by the way, before we go back to Mwanawasa's 2006, remember 72% or somewhere there voted against him in 2001. What is the share in 2006, Ambassador Mwamba? It grows much bigger than the share he had in 2001. Again, a testament to that his economic policy is Mwanawasa does. Had he not died and continued up until 2011, obviously it's difficult to play this game of hypotheticals. I suspect whoever would have been his successor and had the policy of Magande, windfall tax, getting all that money, the $600 million that you're talking about, you spend it on education, health, you keep spending it on agriculture, I think his appointed successor would have done very well in 2011. That's my own estimation. I don't know. So anyways, by 2011, the MMD becomes very unpopular. Now, I don't know if it's the MMD of Mwanawasa or the MMD of Banda, but Banda is in charge at this time. Becomes very unpopular. Michael Sata's platform of doing something for those who are left behind, right? In your pocket, really what one may call a left-leaning platform. policy platform. And the reason why Michael Sata's policy platform, in my estimation, resonates with the people is, I said about the 1990s. The 1990s begin a process of engendering inequality, right? There are lots of youngsters who are left behind in 1990 who get to voting age in 2011, who've been left behind. Lots of young people who are dislocated, who have not had an education, who have not had health care, they've not had the advantages that their parents had during the KK regime. These are completely left behind. And it is amongst these people in this period of massive dislocation, inequality, that I think Michael Sata's message resonates, right? A very pro-poor platform type of message. And Michael Sata wins, quite convincingly. I think, he wins Rupiah Banda by 300,000 votes, if I can remember correctly. So Michael Sata's government comes into power. And immediately Michael Sata embarks again, given that his policy platform is pretty much left-leaning, one might say not so much socialist, but it is left-leaning, and then embarks on a program of a big presence of the state, not as big as Kaunda, but a very big presence of the state in the economy. Infrastructure is something that he prioritizes. And there's a reason why he prioritizes infrastructure. Because the last 20 years, from 1991 up until 2011, with a big chunk of that, government has been under IMF tutelage. We are taught to run cash budgets, right? So things structure were not prioritized, So we were lagging behind in terms of electricity generation. We're lagging behind in terms of roads, lagging behind in terms of hospitals, in terms of schools. So it kind of makes sense.
The population has grown. We need to build power stations or extend, the life of these old power stations.
Correct. So I very much understand the logic of Michael Sata's Patriotic Front to begin to build this infrastructure, right? And at that particular time, what also happens is we can now borrow. Remember the process of getting us a sovereign debt rating that started under Magande and Fundanga now comes to fruition in 2012. So we issue a series of Euro bonds. The Chinese also very important through their own Build Silk and Road initiative in terms of infrastructure. So the Michael Sata administration prioritizes infrastructure, right? That we're going to get this money from these Euro bonds and we're going to pump it into infrastructure, because obviously infrastructure is important for economic development. But like I've always said, there is a fatal flaw in terms of how they thought. The infrastructure itself was great, but the problem is that we were borrowing for a 10 year. We used Euro bonds at 10 years to build power stations, to build roads, and with the expectation that we'll be able to raise enough money. These things that we're building will be able to use a return to pay back. I think this was the fatal flaw. As you know, Ambassador Mwamba, in South Africa, where you and I have lived, even a mortgage for a house is 30 years. You're given 30 years to pay back a mortgage, right? We were borrowing for 10 years to build infrastructure with expectations that we're going to pay back. We were even under, people say, granted, suppose we say my Patriotic Front, the Patriotic Front caused mismanagement, and suppose we got a very good administration in place. Even the best administration was going to default, because of this fatal flaw in this contract. We borrowed for long-term projects over a short period of time. So in any case, the Patriotic Front government of Michael Sata from 2011 to 2014, in a sense, what they do is they prioritize infrastructure, obviously. They prioritize infrastructure. When President Sata dies, unfortunately, and President Edgar Lungu takes the reins, he also continues this infrastructure agenda. But also, unfortunate things happen along the way. We had that drought that happened in 2015, massive climate change shock. Anyways, but in the PF between 2011 and 2021, the story there is prioritizing infrastructure for development. But with the unfortunate thing that we are matching it with short-term bonds. We're paying for this infrastructure with bonds that are 10-year-old bonds. These
are public goods. It's difficult, for example, to put high-top fees on roads. You'll have social unrest.
You'll have social unrest, but even then, they do pay back. I mean,
Yeah.
if you build power stations and roads, you encourage commerce, you
Yeah.
encourage enterprise, but the payback often happens long, and
Yeah.
it's my own sense that if when the history books are written about some of the infrastructure projects in a couple of years' time, with hindsight of history again in 10 years, 15, 20 years' time, they'll have a very different interpretation about what happened between 2011 and 2021, right? It's
Doc,
important.
I
So it's
can say
important to put
something
that.
there. You know, yes, we borrowed and we built infrastructure. But if you look, for example, the energy sector, that should drive your economy. If we didn't upgrade Kariba North Bank, if we didn't build Kafue, Gorge Lower, if we didn't do Itej and upgrade these small ones like Musonda Falls, Shimba Falls, Lunzua, it's not possible that we'll be sitting with the surplus we have. Because we're at 1,600 megawatts, but now we are 3,500 megawatts. Our national consumption at peak is around 2,200 megawatts. So this investment was very critical that it is done. Similarly, the airports, you are a traveler and you've been traveling since 2007. You've seen the changes that has happened to Kenneth Kaunda International Airport, Livingstone, Hari Mwanga Nkumbula, and Simon Mwansaka Pwepwe. That was not possible before. I was actually surprised to see that Simon Mwansaka Pwepwe Airport has become the busiest airport in Zambia. So you are right. When the emotions are out and we just look, though we are looking, for example, at the reign of Dr. Kaunda, history may look at this period of the PF with kinder eyes.
I agree. I mean, it is true. I mean, you're right. What exactly you put it very eloquently there, Ambassador Mwamba. And I think it even goes beyond that. I mean, even just the hospitals that were upgraded, the Matero hospitals, all these other hospitals, the new hospitals that came on stream. These are things which will pay back, just like the University of Zambia. Imagine 96, if somebody had to debate then, should we build a university or continue sending our people abroad? Or, what should we do? I'm sure somebody would have made the argument. Somebody might have made the argument, don't build a university. Don't build, it's a costly thing. It's a waste of money. It's going to be a white elephant. But the University of Zambia is a gift that keeps on giving. Copperbelt University is a gift that keeps on giving. The University Teaching Hospital is a gift that keeps on giving, and so on and so forth, right? So infrastructure is very important. Its payoff is not immediate. So I think the mistake of the Patriotic Front was to fund infrastructure with short-term bonds, with short-term debt.
Yeah.
They were bound to fail. Now, also, remember, it's important for the viewers to, and I think you'll acknowledge this point, there was also mismanagement. Now, it is also important for people to understand there was mismanagement. Mismanagement in the Ford Motor Company. Mismanagement happened in the Kaunda government, in the Chiluba government, in the Mwanawasa government. And we've got to deal with that mismanagement where it happens. But we should not throw the
This now brings me, Doc, to the question of President Hakainde Hichilema. I think he sold himself as an economist. I don't know if he's an economist. He sold himself as Mr. Fix-It, that he has understood where we're coming from and he has the best solutions. Do you think he has deployed the best solutions for our country, looking at what we've just discussed? I thought, with hindsight, you've had 6 presidents to learn from. Yeah. You've had various economic policies to learn from. You've had certain economic policy failures to learn from. Just what are your views?
I think what strikes me is the importance of whom you pick ministers. I think this is a very important, underrated aspect of Zambian policymaking. I remember President Sata's first Minister of Finance is Alexander Waliachikwanda, who also served for many years in Dr. Kaunda's and a distinguished career in Dr. Kaunda's government. So he grew up in Dr. Kaunda's government. It is no surprise, therefore, that Alexander Walech presided over a Ministry of Finance and a government that thought about infrastructure in the way we did. That infrastructure is a long-term investment in people, and it's also an investment whose gift will pay off forever, right? Now, we just talked about Dr. Msokotwane, not an issue about press, but I think Dr. Msokotwane sees the world very, very differently.
Correct.
You know, the very fact that he was able to reverse that windfall tax issue under President Banda also speaks to who he is ideologically, how he sees the world. You know, how he sees the world, because taking away a windfall tax is very much a Washington consensus type of policy. It's a policy that the people in Washington, the IMF and World Bank love. Do not tax private sector.
Yeah.
Let private sector flourish so that private sector create the job, which is often a lie. You know, you've got to force private sector to create the jobs. Anyway, so President Hichilema...
In fact, at every turmoil at any industry, the first things they sacrifice are jobs.
Are jobs. Of course, they got to cut costs. But they've got to be reminded, and this is why that analogy of the tail should not lead the dog.
Yeah.
You know, the dog should lead the tail. At any point, private sector always wants to cut costs. But they've got to be reminded that they exist in a wider society, in a wider context, right? Where there are other objectives as well, right? Beyond just, you've got to also participate in nation building, etc., etc. Anyways, so this is to say, when President Hichilema selected Dr. Msokotwane as Minister of Finance, I wasn't surprised what followed thereafter, because one of the first things that Msokotwane said upon assuming the role of Minister of Finance was, we're going to go to the IMF to resolve our debt. Even before we had a consultative process. Even before, I remember even before cabinet was fully constituted, you recall that it took a while for President Hichilema to appoint the full. Before that had happened, they had already decided that we're going to go for an IMF program.
Yeah.
And the IMF has never assisted anybody. They create pain in the way they created pain in the 90s, not just in Zambia, everywhere else. Voluminous literature has been written about the IMF and how the IMF creates pain and makes things worse for the patient. So, Ambassador Mwamba, to answer your question, when you asked me, has he picked the best economic policy for Zambia, the answer is no. And I think it is not just me speaking in an armchair and theorizing. The facts on the ground in Zambia as they stand today speaks to them. I think we made a mistake to put our eggs in the IMF basket. We made a massive mistake. I strongly believe it was possible, Ambassador Mwamba, just when President Hichilema took the reins in 2021, to begin a process of bilaterally renegotiating our debt with the different creditors, especially important, the most important being China. China alone had like 6 billion of our debt. You gave me a number of 11 billion. This is more than 50%. So if you can get China on board, a big chunk of your headache goes away. And if you get China on board and get one or two others with 2 billion, already a big chunk of your headache goes away. So you didn't really need to go this route of the IMF. It was always puzzled me why we put our eggs in the IMF basket, we put our eggs in the common framework basket. It is now almost 3 years, and this thing hasn't been conclusively resolved. We've lost so much time, we've created so much uncertainty, and in the process, because we're on an IMF program without the benefits of debt resolution, the debt hasn't been resolved, but we're still on an IMF program, and an IMF program which puts you in a straitjacket, that constricts how much you can spend on subsidies, that constricts the level of intervention that you can engage in an economy. We've created pain. So we've swallowed the medicine, it has made us worse, and there's not even a benefit. There's not even any fruits that we were promised. It's like a patient in a hospital, you've got the wrong medicine and nobody's even bringing you the fruits. So this is where we are, Ambassador Mwamba. I think President Hichilema, now, President Hichilema, I don't want to say this because I have respect for Dr. Msokotwane, but I think he was a wrong man for the task that was needed. He was a wrong man maybe from a different era for a task that was needed in 2021. This is my own conclusion.
Done 60 years as a country, as we march towards the next generation and the next 60 years, I'm soliciting for your opinions, learning from the past. What can we do better? How can we leapfrog to a first world country?
Thanks, Ambassador Mwamba. It's been a very interesting conversation. I think learning from the past, at the end of the day, we understand that when we say development, really, we're not just meaning development for a few people, development for some people, but development for all Zambians. And I think the big lesson from the past for me is that that kind of development, that kind of upward mobility that we spoke about, that kind of broad-based poverty reduction, that kind of granting opportunities for all happens when the state has a non-trivial role in the economy, when the state has a very big role in the economy, also when Zambians control the means of production, as happened during Kenneth. This is the only reason why we were able to foster that kind of upward mobility, Ambassador Mwamba, that you probably benefited from, that I benefited from, that my parents benefited from, that many other people from, that probability, that essentially thinking that it didn't matter where you were born or what family you were born in, you had a chance to take part in the Zambian dream. And really,
you've had the opportunity, Doc, you've had the opportunity to look at China. How did they do it? How did they lift 500 million people from being poor to the middle class? What did they do right? For example, the role of private investment in a literally state-controlled economy.
That's true. I mean, the Chinese story is a story of, by the way, one of the biggest miracles of our time. In 1981, 88% or 90% of Chinese were poor. By 2010, that number had dropped to just under 10%. So you're very right, Ambassador Mwamba, that hundreds of millions of Chinese have been saved from poverty in just 30 years. I think, again, it's a non-trivial role for the state. The Chinese state is very, very important in China. Yes, there's some aspect of private enterprise, but that enterprise follows the state, not that the state follows private enterprise. You know, this private enterprise in China follows marching orders from the state, which is to say the state sets the terms of debate, the terms of engagement, direction of the country, and private sector follows. That's the essence, that's the magic. All right, and obviously there's a very big role for industrialization. Industrialization is very important, right? You've got to have industry. That's the only way through history that we've been able to create jobs, reduce poverty, is through industry. And this is why we sometimes refer to the developed countries as the industrialized countries. You know, so it's not a mystery that industry is very important for development. But what's even more important is the state should direct private sector. The state should the state should set the terms of debate. This is very important. The state should do the planning. The state should create the environment for private sector to thrive. The state should also create industries. Those places the private sector cannot create industries. It's incredibly important. And then private sector follows thereafter. So this for me is, I think the issue is to go back to the lessons of the calendar years, obviously update them from the 21st century. But in my estimation, the calendar experiment worked. Of steam, and it ran out of steam not because for things that they had done, but because of external factors, as we just discussed in this conversation. But
Doc, there's also good lessons from India, where the case of SMEs has really thrived, where small and medium enterprises, I think they're not driving this large economy.
But India, Ambassador Mwamba, you're right, there's some success stories in India, but India has had a very difficult time in reducing poverty. Indian poverty is still stubbornly high. In fact, when about India and China side by side, one country has had tremendous success in reducing poverty, and that is China. One country, India, has had some success. It has made some Indian people phenomenally wealthy, Inequality has risen in India a great deal, but has not had this tremendous success in poverty reduction that China has had. And the difference for me, Ambassador, is again the role of the state. India is not, when I see India and side by side with China, the Indian state plays a much smaller role. Again, it's kind of environment where private sector, capitalist class set the terms of debate, set the direction, in many ways, set the policy direction, set the direction where the country is going. But China is different. China, the Communist Party, sets the terms of debate, sets the direction of the country, and then says, private sector, come and participate. But we're going in this direction. You don't want to go with us in this direction, then don't come at all. Right? And
the Arabs also do provide an example. They are like us in Africa. They are well resourced. We are sitting on a resource of copper. What can we learn from the Arab world?
Yeah, and the first thing is, what do? They own their resource. They control the means. They own their resource. If outside to participate in the exploitation of their resource, that outside participation is done on the terms that the Arabs set themselves. So if you look at Saudi Arabia, which is next door, Saudi Aramco is a state company. That's the big oil company, Saudi Aramco. It's a state company. So they own this. And then they use that resource to power other aspects of their economy, but at their terms, with the state setting the objectives. We want to go in this direction. We're going to use some of the oil revenues to go in this direction. We can use these oil revenues because we own the oil. We own the rights to the oil, but we want this direction. Anybody else who wants to come and go with us in this direction, they'll have to go in this direction on our terms. This is the thing that I think has gone wrong in our gated policy making in our country to the IMF and World Bank and to private sector. Private sector people in Zambia set the terms of debate, set the terms of engagement, even set the policy direction. Right? In many ways.
I know you're an economist, but speak to the issues of democracy and that thriving spirit of democracy. Does it help foster development?
I mean, you're asking me a very difficult question. And now we have to be very careful here. I'm a Democrat, and we have to define what we mean by democracy. That people find representation of their views in national policy, in national direction, in the direction that the country is taking, that people find representation of their preferences in the articulation of national goals, national policy, national direction. This is how I understand that democracy. Now, we have a version that we are performing in some of our countries, which is essentially ballot box democracy, where the democracy only happens every 5 years, and that ritual called an election, right? So I don't know. I mean, I have no idea whether this manifestation of democracy in that way is helps or hinders development. It's a very tricky thing, and I think it's very difficult for one to wrap their heads around. But it's not one that is easy to say clearly that having this 5-year ritual where we elect people and then we hate each other in the intervening 5 years, and national unity, because for development to happen, you have to have national unity. You've got to have national unity. And national unity essentially means we're all agreed on where we want to go, and we're going to get there, right? So, I mean, it's tricky. Ambassador Mwamba is a very tricky thing. I don't have a conclusive answer one way or the other, but I think as the articulation, as a representation of those preferences and views and ideals and aspiration in the national direction, that's important. Now, how you do it,
Doc, we are sitting
properly different.
We are sitting at a good period in sense of history. There's a migration of energy, from fossil fuels to green energy, and Zambia is privileged that some of the minerals required to power this migration is in Zambia: copper, cobalt, manganese, lithium, nickel. They are here. What should we do so that this chance doesn't pass us by?
Yeah, we've got to grab it by its horns. We've got to grab this opportunity with both hands. But to be honest, it is going to be very difficult to take advantage of this rare opportunity if we don't own these resources. That's the only thing. Very difficult to take advantage of this opportunity if we don't own these resources. We've got to own these resources. In those periods when we have owned our resources, when we've owned copper, those are the periods where I think, in my estimation, there's been broad-based prosperity, there's been broad-based upward mobility. These are the things that people want. People don't want to be trapped in the townships. People don't want to be trapped in the villages. People don't want to be trapped in poverty. They want their children to have a chance. And I think this has only happened when we have owned our resources in such a way that we can use the bounty from those resources to spend on education, on health, and experiment with industry. So, Ambassador Mwamba, this opportunity passes us by, I think, if we don't own these resources in a non-trivial way. And, this is, by the way, we didn't talk about this, I think, in the Patriotic Front government, there was a manner in which it was executed. Principle of taking over some of our mines, I think, was in principle, execution was bad, but in principle, and part of it was that the mines had been playing games with us. I mean, Van Ganta was playing games with us. Glencoe was playing games with us, not wanting to pay, dodging taxes, hiding profits, all these kinds of things which private sector does. Private sector, again, we have a very rosy view of private sector. Private sector has to be watched very close. Private sector has to follow the nation, not the nation following private sector. Essentially, that's very important in my estimation. So, to ask Ambassador Mwamba, this opportunity will pass us by if we continue to have trivial, control in these my enterprises. We've got to have a non-trivial role. This is a lesson of history. This is why KK was able to, and his people were able to do that upward mobility. It was sort of supported by ZCCM. It was supported by the fact that we own the mines. So we could then subsidize all these other things, which then engendered upward mobility. That's the logic. I can't think of any country that's been able to develop when they don't own their resources. I really can't think. They don't own the resources. And then use those resources.
Yeah, learning the history of the IMF and World Bank in Africa in the last 60 years, what are your views? Should we have embraced them too quickly in the manner this government did?
Yeah, I think it was a mistake to embrace them too quickly. We needed to wait a little bit. Like I said, in fact, I think we shouldn't even have embraced them at all. I mean, there's a place maybe for, there's a place on the table for IMF advice. We can listen to them, but we don't need to do what they're telling us to do. We could have done things differently. There is no place in this world, Ambassador Mwamba, that has engaged with the IMF and not created pain for its people. At the end of the day, what is the economy for? The economy is not there to create pain, to impose pain on the people. The economy is there to support people to meet their foods. That's what the economy. What use is the economy if this economy is causing pain? Right? That's the point. That's the reason why we have an economy. And I think a Minister of Finance, their most important responsibility is to make sure that the economy is supporting people's aspirations. The economy is increasing mobility, reducing poverty, creating jobs. That's what they should be backing with. That's what they should be thinking about on a daily basis. So we should not have engaged the IMF at all. And what is very sad is the level with which we engage. There was a talk that the PF government had also wanted to engage the IMF. But it seemed to me like there was a discussion and there was points of disagreements. For example, I think the issue of subsidy removals was a sticking point. Now, I don't want to use...
I can tell you the history of the IMF with the PF. President Michael Sata engaged them, dropped subsidies in fuel, and there was a march towards...
There were direct subsidies, Ambassador Mwamba, right? Yeah,
yes,
he dropped not the indirect ones, not the tax ones, exactly.
Correct.
Some subsidies.
Yeah. Then Edgar Lungu began to engage them. The IMF had issues with our debt. They thought that there was no disclosure of our debt, especially the Chinese debt. So they engaged in that debt discovery. They did a debt analysis that you are aware of from 2017 to 2019, and they recognized that we were threatened by debt distress. So they said before they could give this bailout, we needed to restructure our debt. you spoke to this matter earlier. What the PF decided was that the private debt of Eurobond and other commercial debt will be handled by Lazard Ferres, that French firm. And the biggest debt we had was with China. And they said they will engage China bilaterally, directly. In fact, there was even some immediate relief. There was a write-off of debt of up to $200 million. The engagement was suddenly cut off when President Hakainde Hichilema won. He abandoned that process and elected to go with the IMF, who imposed this G20 framework, where now, first we haven't gotten any debt forgiveness. I believe we could have gotten some debt forgiveness from China, maybe war or maybe up to 3/4 of the amount. I know people say, were you borrowing to have it written off? No. But China is the only one that could have written off that debt.
And even if they didn't, Mwamba, even if they insisted we pay back, but I believe it would have been over a much longer time horizon, which in many ways can qualify as, some write-off, a much longer horizon. In fact, China does tend to favor maturity extension as opposed to outright write-offs. But the maturity extension can happen over such a sufficiently long level of time that it creates some fiscal room in your budget. You're right. I mean, it seemed to me it was a no-brainer. Debt is owed to China. If we can just sit down with China and have that resolved, it gives us a lot of breathing room. And then try to talk to one or two others. Right, gives you immense amounts of breathing room. And once you've restructured China, you've restructured some other debt. The other ones who are still holding out may be forced to just come on board as well. This is how you play it. And I think we could have played this game. But I was very surprised how speedily we ran to the IMF immediately after the election. It's still a bizarre mystery for me. I wish we were taking our time. I wish we had consulted wide. I think we'd be in a very different position. I mean, it's almost 3 years now, but April, Ambassador Mwamba, is the third anniversary of when framework thing, right? This is when, the third anniversary of when we went to this common framework thing. The issue is still unresolved. August until President Hichilema, when President Hichilema took over, the issue is still unresolved. It is still unresolved. There's still uncertainty in the air. This is why the Kwacha is always behaving. We haven't resolved this thing conclusively. And I think the window to resolve it has completely disappeared. In fact, at some point, remember when President Hichilema was elected, the markets were very favorable towards him.
Yes, so very optimistic.
I thought to myself, let's go out and take out another bond and try to sort out some of these things right now. This is the time. Let's go to the market, see if we can take out another bond. But all this to say that there were many ideas on the table that were floating around, which did not like information. But unfortunately, the government didn't want to entertain those ideas. They didn't want to consult widely. They were hell-bent, for one reason or the other, for reasons that I don't know. They were hell-bent on going the IMF route. And Ambassador Mwamba, I was at the IMF World Bank spring meetings last week or 2 weeks ago. I attended the ones last. The one thing I noticed that is different this year around, Zambia is not on the agenda. Wasn't on the agenda. Last year we were, but we've really gone out of the agenda. We're no longer the talk of the town, and this is what happens when you rely on outsiders. You get of the week, the Americans have moved on to something else.
Our 15 minutes of fame is over, and we didn't exploit the opportunities. I like something you said about China and the maturities. One of the largest loans we ever took was for Tazara. It was over 460 million at the time. I don't know how many billions those are this now.
Probably $2 billion.
The loan was
probably $2 billion.
Yeah, it was a grace period of 40 years. To date, I don't even think we've even paid a single way to that loan.
There you have it. Often, and with China, it's politics. There are brief tensions to outright debt write-offs. It's internal politics. They don't want the Chinese, the people to see that the government is not freebies to another country. But when you couch it as a maturity extension, you're essentially doing the same thing, except you're still arguing that, no, they're going to pay. Even if they haven't forgiven them. We should have taken advantage of this. We really should have taken advantage of this. We should have gone to China, continued the engagement. The president should not have done is like a US-wide bent. It's obvious tilt to the US. It was too obvious. It was plain for everybody to see. He should not have done that. He should have handled it very delicately. I believe we'd be in a different point today. But China has moved on. I don't think China is as obsessed about Zambia as they were 2 or 3 years ago. And sadly, the world is not as obsessed with Zambia as they were 2 or 3 years ago. They've moved on to Ukraine. They've moved on to Israel, Palestine. We're no longer on top of the agenda. And this is why it's important for us to be in the driving seat, Ambassador.
And you could feel it when you were in Washington for the spring meetings.
Yes. Feel it. Zambia was there last year and this year. Last year, Zambia was very much on the agenda. Everywhere you went, people were talking about Zambia, because then there was a feeling that the restructuring deal was imminent. But this year they've moved on. It's different things that people are worried about. They've completely moved on. I don't think I could see that. I could sense it. That the world has moved on, unfortunately, and we're left to pick up the pieces.
Dr. Grieve Chelwa, I think the nation has benefited from this discussion, and I think we'll reflect on our next 6 years as we look back on our past 6 years. Just give me your last words before we close.
God has given us a very beautiful country, Ambassador. We've been so lucky to have had peace. No accident. I think it's the result of careful on the part of our founding fathers and mothers. We've been resourced. There's no reason why our people should be hungry, should be poor, should be literate. We could do better. There's a lot to learn. There's a lot to learn. First generation of leaders, their sacrifice, their patriotism, their belief in this project. And in my estimation, it seems like that has gone away. This belief in Zambia. We've got to believe in our country. We've got to love it. We've got to do everything we can to develop it. I'm very hopeful, though. I think there is a new generation that is, seeing things differently. I'm very hopeful, Ambassador Mwamba. I'm very hopeful the future, but we've got to put in the work. We've got to put in the hard work. Those will be my last words. I'm optimistic, even though things may be difficult.
Thank you very much. I'll likely call you for another discussion for specific topics like current affairs, whether it's on the mines or it's on finance or any other matter. But I'm grateful that from your serious, busy schedule, you spared us time. You left Madam Mwansa and the kids in your spare time to come and speak to us. And with your busy schedule at the Institute, we're very, very grateful.
This is a wonderful platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Dear viewers, we were speaking to an associate professor of political economy at the Africa Institute in the UAE, Dr. Grieve Chelwa. He was giving his insights about the economic path that the country has taken in the last 60 years and what we should do in the next 60 years. Until we have another special guest, I would like to thank you for being with us, for staying with us, and for enjoying this program. God bless our country. God bless Zambia. God bless you. Shalom, shalom.